So as he said, my name is Chris Czub. I work at Duo Security, where I am a security research engineer. In practice, that means I wear a lot of hats. It's a startup. I've done everything from external security research, finding vulnerabilities, to corporate security engineering to keep our internal assets safe, to product-facing engineering even. And at Duo, we are a two-factor authentication provider. As he said, we also focus on something called trusted access, where we use things like the verified access API in Chrome or the TPM modules on Windows and or on Intel processors to try to have hardware attestations about the hardware you're using so that you know that people are using managed devices. You know that they're using two-factor. You can control which applications they're accessing. We have a lot of large clients, whether they be large tech companies, government, healthcare, universities, et cetera. And with all that comes a lot of data. So we see over 4 million authentication events each day. Actually, this stat was from April. Now it's around 5 million. We have millions of phones and endpoints that have authenticated against our service. We had a lot of growth in 2015, 2016. So I just want to show you the biggest data that we have at Duo. Here he is. So let's take this data and also take some of the FUD that we see in the industry and some of my own observations, some of our corporate talking points, et cetera, and have some fun with it. So right now, when we do security, we often focus on this kind of defense in depth approach, where for any kind of threat that might be facing you, any kind of issue that might befall your networks, your machines, there is some product that some vendor will sell you to fix that. You could buy all these products, but really they'll just become expense in depth. You'll wind up buying these things, you won't understand them, it'll be complex. Steve talked about this complexity earlier and how you can't just buy more technology and expect that to solve problems for you. You need to understand it. This complexity can breed insecurity in itself too. We see this again and again. For example, when Target got breached, they used their own configuration management software against them after stealing credentials for it. They didn't understand the way that their systems interacted and that you could even get from a contractor system to the configuration management. We think that simple doesn't need to mean insecure. It's actually easier to wrap your head around a simple system. And is it any wonder that we're being convinced that we need to buy these expensive solutions to stop these threats? Who knows what this is? This is Apti. He is the sponsor for ThreatBut, and ThreatBut is really the only cyber threat mat you need. Probably don't need this one. So we're talking about cyber war, we're talking about APTs, we're talking about government-sponsored hackers, but really these people will use simple techniques if that'll take you down. If you're failing on your basic security hygiene, you're not using good passwords, you're not using two-factor authentication, you're allowing your systems to get infected by malware because people are taking their systems home and playing video games and their kids use them and then bringing them to work and accessing your configuration management software or what have you, you're going to get owned. And we see this even in government. CIA director hacked by a teen. So Dell SecureWorks wrote about this as well in their experience. When they put out a report, they said that they saw this over and over again. Attackers using security tools, configuration management tools, et cetera, to leverage access across the network. And it doesn't get much better for endpoint security either. So when we look at endpoint security tools, this was about 6 months ago, we tried installing a trial version of an endpoint security software package. It wanted us to install Java, Flash, and Silverlight. Is Silverlight even a thing anymore? This was like 6 months ago. So I told you we'd look at some data, so let's start diving into that now. I won't say BIG data, I promise you. So we took a look when iOS 8.4.1 came out. That release fixed over 70 critical severity vulnerabilities. And of all the phones that authenticate against Duo that people are using to authenticate, to log into their Salesforce, their SSH sessions, whatever they're protecting, 91% of them had not updated to iOS 8.4.1 within a week following its release. We want to fix that with our trusted access story, say, hey, if you're not patched, you can't access things. And then we saw the same thing repeated for iOS 9 when we looked at our data. 86% of users there, nearly the same percentage, 91%, 86%, high numbers of users are just not patching quickly. But we are in a position where we can force people to do that if we can control the devices that they're using, check their patch level, and then refuse them access to services if they're not staying up to date. And when we took a month-long view at iOS 9 adoption, after it had been out for a month, on October 16th, it still wasn't even at 50% adoption, and there were still plenty of phones using versions below iOS 7. So really, we saw some good, some bad, and some ugly when we looked at iOS data across the phones authenticating against Duo. We saw the good was that 48% of them were up to date. They're running iOS 9.2 or above. They had both Touch ID and a passcode enabled, which gave them the best disk encryption available on an iPhone. We also saw some bad. 50% of them were running old versions of iOS, and they only had either Touch ID or a passcode enabled. And the plain ugly were the 2% of phones in our data set. They were running old versions of iOS below iOS 8, no Touch ID, no passcode whatsoever. Just pick that phone up, do whatever you want with it. Mobile BYOD, it looks a little better for iOS than Android in our data set, which you might expect due to Android fragmentation. So fewer than 0.01% of all the iPhones in our data set we detected as being jailbroken. Over 90% of them used at least a passcode. Only 2% of the phones were iPhone 4s or older, which can't receive updates anymore. 4 and 5 phones that were using Touch ID sensors were actually using them, that had one present were using them. But still, we saw that about half of all iPhones were at least one iOS update behind. And when we looked at Android, it got bleaker. So for Android, a third of active Android devices authenticating against Duo were running version 4.0 and below. Version 4.0 is Ice Cream Sandwich. That came out at the end of 2011 and was discontinued by 2012. We took these stats in 2016. 1 in 20 Android devices are jailbroken, compared to only 1 in 250 iPhones. And then 1 in 3 Android devices don't use passcodes on their lock screens, compared to only 1 in 20 on Apple devices. And we know this fragmentation is real. We've seen over 3,700 unique Android handset models authenticate against Duo. How many iOS devices do you think we've seen authenticate against Duo? Not that many. When we look at laptops, it doesn't really get any better either. So for OS X endpoints authenticating against Duo, 54% of the Macs that we saw were running an unsupported operating system that would be an old major release. For example, Mavericks that doesn't get patches anymore. Or they were running a supported release, but they hadn't applied all the available security patches. And then 66% of the Macs that were authenticating against us weren't running the latest major version whatsoever, which at the time that we wrote this was El Capitan. Of course, that's Sierra now, and that number will be even lower because it only came out a few weeks ago. Web browsers, not a better story. Well, it is for Chrome. Chrome auto updates, and it's pretty great. But Firefox, when a new version of Firefox came out in December 2015, after 23 days, only 50% of users had updated their Firefox. That number peaked at around 69% of Firefox users being up to date after 42 days of a new release. But then a new version came out and knocked that back down to 0. So who has any predictions about how well people are keeping Flash and Java up to date on their systems? Yeah, we're not even going to go into that. It's a dumpster fire. And not all verticals are equal in our data set either. So hospitals, the places where you go to get life-saving operations done, the like, they're 2 times more likely than any other vertical in our data set to have Flash installed, 3 times more likely to have Java installed on their endpoints. So I had the luck of working on this really cool research project with my teammates on Duo Labs. We called it out-of-box exploitation. So what we did is we bought a bunch of popular Windows laptops from all the major manufacturers, and then just started tearing apart the crapware. And we found a lot of cool things. We found eDell root, where they had Dell had a root certificate that was trusted by default, and they had the private key next to it. So if you wanted to man the middle any Dell users' SSL communications, you just need to buy another Dell laptop and find that private key. We found issues where you could use cross-site request forgery to execute arbitrary code on machines. So you could do a drive-by attack and put an image tag on a page and own anyone using that manufacturer's computers. Really, my colleague Darren Kemp summed it up with his first sentence here. Spoiler, we broke all of them. Every vendor was broken that we looked at. Every single one had at least one vulnerability that could allow for a man-in-the-middle attacker to execute arbitrary code as system. Every single one. And the bad thing was that these bugs were not hard to find. We found these really quickly and easily. So we weren't the first people to find these. We burned these on someone who'd probably been using these. But when we reported them to the vendors, a lot of researchers know this story, a lot of them didn't even get fixed. So when it comes to security, I think that Dave kind of talked on this. We should be having better security hygiene and just getting the basics right. So what we should really be doing is making sure that every authentication that we perform, every user and every service is using two-factor. And that systems are up to date and we're not allowing them to use unmanaged devices to access our services that we care about. But what we're really doing instead is this expense and depth approach where we're just throwing more technology at the problem. And it's not actually fixing the problems that cause breaches. When you look at the Verizon DBIR, for example, 63% of breaches in the Verizon DBIR were related to stolen or weak credentials. We have a good solution for that. It's called two-factor, but still 63%. So really, to use a disease control analogy, we should just be doing the equivalent of washing our hands. It's very effective at stopping the spread of disease. Patient outcomes are much better if a doctor washes their hands. If you went and saw a doctor and he wasn't washing your hands, you'd probably run away pretty quickly. But really what we've been doing is kind of the patent medicine approach to technology security, where we're using the equivalent of cocaine tooth drops to solve problems rather than just washing our hands. So I think we should try and raise the bar here. I really like this clip art of this computer lifting a weight. I fit perfectly. So Chromebooks, we think Chromebooks raise the bar. Chromebooks have trusted security coprocessor inside of them. You can do device attestation. It has crypto material built in there so you can verify it's a Chromebook device that you know about. And Google's doing their own part to raise the bar by offering a $100,000 bug bounty on Chromebooks. And they paid this out just a couple weeks ago. So there are going to be a lot of researchers looking at this, trying to get that payout. And from an attacker's perspective, they might want that payout too. If they don't think that breaching your organization will net them $100,000, they'll just give it to Google maybe. I think that's a good position to be in, where in order to land malware on your device, they're giving up $100,000. It's not a bad spot to be in. We think YubiKey raises the bar with their authentication devices. So who knows what a YubiKey is? Can I see? Yeah, okay. I don't really need to explain them then, but you need to actually physically touch it with your finger in order to perform the authentication. We think that raises the bar. It can't be infected by malware. The private key material is only on the YubiKey, and it can only perform a signing operation when you physically touch it. So really, it's this built-in security versus bolt-on security that's raising the bar, and that's what we need to be focusing on, whether it be things like built-in encryption on iOS, or Chromebook device attestations, or YubiKey keeping the key material private and requiring physical touch to activate it. The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed yet. This technology is available to us. We should be using it. So where do we go now from here in this mess of security that we've made? Well, I put in a buzzword here, deperimeterization. So from the IT 1.0 model, where we had strongly defined network boundary and everything was kind of inside of that, and you didn't talk to machines outside of it. You had everything locked down. Then we went to the IT 2.0 model, where you wanted to expose things to the wider internet, the client-server model. So you have your firewalls and your DMZs, and network boundaries are still defined, and you watch the ingress and egress points. That's where a lot of the current security solutions came around. But now we're in this IT 3.0 model, where it's cloud and mobile. People are using their mobile devices. They're going over mobile cell networks. You're not going to see that in your firewall. And other companies are noticing this too. Google outlined the same vision with BeyondCorp. So they're saying that there's no perimeter any longer, and you need to focus on authentication, authorization, and encryption. And their vision is to allow people to work from anywhere using cloud-based workflows and limit their access by policies, which is the same as our trusted access story. Microsoft has the same story. At Microsoft Ignite, they just revealed this. Conditional access, they call it. But it's the same thing. We need to focus on the fundamentals. We need to get security hygiene right from the ground up. Really, in the Maslow's hierarchy of security needs, what a lot of us have been doing is kind of focusing up here at the top on detection, response, and prevention. We've been ignoring the bottom of the hierarchy where we really should be focusing, which is having a good strategy in place, making sure that we're getting the fundamentals right before we worry about esoteric long tail attacks that might never hit us. Really, what'll take you out is a shitty password. So the federal government has been having trouble with IT security, as you might know. Eric Schmidt spoke to President Obama, and he gave him 3 pieces of advice. He said, make sure you're using strong authentication. Know the devices people are using. Make sure they're up to date. And make sure they're using encryption whenever possible. That's the same advice that I would give to you. So before I get off stage, I would like to leave everyone with a few parting questions here. Just kind of take back home with you and think about, first of all, are all of your services and users using two-factor? Do you have control over the endpoint devices that people are using? Do you know that they're managed and up to date? Can you verify that patch level of them? And then finally, what is the most expensive security tool that you have right now? And how much value is it actually providing to you? That's the end of my slides. I'm open for questions. And if you want to find me, talk about anything afterwards, go for it. We're hiring. Yeah. Everywhere. Yeah. Any kind of technical sales, anything. Yeah. All of it. Yeah, so that can be difficult. Yeah, I mean, I would say evaluate these questions. And if the answer to any of those is no, that's a good priority to focus on. And then if you can say yes to those, then I would start looking at some of the more, monitoring solutions and getting a better insight of what's going on in your network and things like that. But you need to get these fundamentals right first. All right, thank you.